Next comes the MIDI keyboard controller. This is an important piece of studio gear as it's the part that you'll be physically touching more than anything else. So not only does the keyboard action have to feel right for playability, but so do the pitch and modulation wheels, the sliders, dials, switches and buttons. Now I have absolutely no idea why, but it would appear that most MIDI keyboard manufacturers just don't take MIDI keyboard controllers seriously, choosing instead to build them cheaply out of tacky plastics. It's as if some of these manufacturers treat MIDI keyboards like cheap computer peripherals, such as a £30 inkjet printer for example. Honestly, some of the ones I've tried during the past 6 or 7 months have been appalling. And even some of the ones are from companies like Roland and Korg. The Roland A500 Pro feels like a cheap plastic toy, it's lightweight with no metal inside, and the keyboard action feels cheap and tacky also. It's kind of like the thing you'd expect to find in a 5-year-old's playroom more than something you'd expect to find in a recording studio. I can say the same for the Korg Triton Tactile MIDI keyboard controller, which comes in at a little more than the Roland at about £280, but again, it just feels like a cheap plastic piece of junk. I tried one of these out in my local music shop and it felt like I could have broken it over my knee without too much effort. Most of the M-Audio ones I tried were also terrible. The Nectar Panorama models felt incredibly cheap and nasty, and after taking delivery of the P6, the entire thing was actually warped. The keyboard literally had a hill in the middle as it dipped down towards the edges, due to probably the way the plastic had somehow curved, possibly during the cooling process at the factory, and to make things worse, the action was toy-like in playability. The Novation and Native Instrument offerings stepped things up a little bit in quality and playability, but even they were a little bit outside my comfort zone in build quality. I know that MIDI keyboards are not designed to be gigging instruments that would not be taken out on the road, so nobody would really expect the build quality to be right up there with something like a vintage Yamaha DX7 for example, but I still can't understand why most of them feel like cheap plastic toys, especially where some of them are actually taken out and gigged. You'll quite often find a synthesizer player that will head off out to a gig with an inner flight case and a laptop. The last MIDI keyboard that I had was an Akai Advance 49, which was well made, had a nice keyboard with nice sliders and switches, with nice touchy pads, and it was almost perfect had it not been for the keyboard action. The action was great until you tried to play any of the white keys between the black ones, or close to the back of the keys themselves. Due to the pivot point being so far forward, the further back you tried to play any given key, the harder it became, which killed any chances of being able to perform an emotional interpretation that required a Mozart-type feel and response. Anyway, I recently discovered a French keyboard company called Arturia, and what a breath of fresh air they turned out to be. Arturia make a few different models of MIDI keyboard controller, as well as some fully fledged synthesizers too. So the model that I've decided to go with for my MIDI keyboard controller work is their amazing Keylab MKII in the 49 key version that I've got here, which costs around £450. But once you take delivery of one and try it, you'll soon know where that money went. Of course, you can buy MIDI keyboard controllers at half this price, but as I've already mentioned, most of them just feel like cheap, plastic, tacky keyboards with terrible actions. The Arturia Keylab MKII, on the other hand, is the Rolls-Royce of MIDI keyboard controllers. It's built like a tank, it's reassuringly heavy, and it's made out of an all-metal construction, and it even has these wooden inlays on the sides. The Keylab MKII really does feel like a professional gigging synthesizer, the kind of thing that you could put in a flight case and tour with. It's that well built. In fact, the Keylab MKII reminds me of my old Yamaha DX27 and some of those amazing vintage synths from the 80s with all their metal construction and high build quality. The main dial in the center here, the sliders and the pan pots and the pads all feel very professional with a nice tactile feedback. The pitch and modulation wheels are actually made out of metal and they're very smooth to use with just the right amount of weight and resistance, while the keyboard action itself is actually the same as that Arturia used in their high-end £1,850 Matrix Brute analog synth, and what a great action it is too. It really is a pleasure to play this action. The Arturia Keylab MKII that I have here also comes in a 61 key version, the latter coming in at about £50 more. Also, I just want to let you know that Arturia also make a budget MIDI keyboard controller called the Essential, which also comes in 49 and 61 key versions, and they cost £170 and £210 respectively. But these budget-friendly models are not to be confused with this more professional Keylab MKII that I have here. Unlike the Keylab, with its solid metal construction, heavy weight and superior keyboard action, the Essential models are mostly made of plastic, they're much lighter and they have a different action. Having said that, if you don't have £450 to spend on the professional Keylab, then the Essential is still way better than most of the budget MIDI keyboard controllers out there, and certainly a lot better than most of the ones that I've mentioned already. The Keylab MKII also has a cluster of 16 finger drum pads up here, and it has 10 buttons and 6 playback controls for your DAW, and it comes with magnetic templates for some of the most common DAWs too. This just actually removes and you've got different templates on either side, and then it just drops back over the top of the keyboard like so. This is a great feature as it means you don't have to keep reaching for the mouse every 10 seconds. There are also 9 faders and activation buttons with lights under them and accompanying pan pots at the top. Okay, in the center of the console you'll find the main dial and menu display for changing the various settings and parameters, including choosing your DAW from the pre-configured list. There are also 3 other buttons that allow you to change between Analog Lab, DAW or User, which brings me nicely onto the best part of this superb MIDI keyboard controller. And that's just it, it's not just a MIDI keyboard controller, it's also a synthesizer. When you buy the Keylab MKII, it comes bundled with Arturia's absolutely amazing analog synth models, with around 31 classic vintage synthesizers and thousands of sounds. Basically, Arturia have done for vintage analog synth modeling what UAD have done for guitar amp modeling. Some of you will know exactly what I mean by that, others might not. But if you don't, let me just say that nobody on the planet does analog synth modeling better than this company. Trust me on this, I've been around long enough and I've owned and used enough vintage analog synths back in the mid to late 80s, and I know. I've had enough hands-on experience with the real thing, and I can tell you that the sounds from Arturia's analog synths are about as good as it gets to the real thing. They really are that good. So if you've always fancied owning a vintage Yamaha CS80, but either couldn't find one or didn't fancy spending £10,000 on one when they rarely come up for sale second hand, no problem. The Arturia CS80 model is out of this world. In fact, if somebody stuck a gun to my head, I might even go as far as saying that it's indistinguishable from the real thing. Other classic synths include the world famous Prophet 5, Hammond B3, Yamaha DX7, OBXA, and let's not forget the Jupiter 8 and Juno 6, and there are many others too. When using the Arturia Analog Lab 5 software, you simply hit the Analog Lab button on the keyboard and all the pan pots, faders, buttons, pitch, modulation and others are automatically mapped to any given vintage synth that you select. By default, the free bundled synth sounds are all there to use, and sticking with the Yamaha CS80 for a minute, there are hundreds of sounds that various professional designers have come up with by adjusting all the various sliders, dials, buttons, parameters, settings, just as they would have if they had a physical CS80 in front of them. And most of these sounds are probably better than anything that you or I could come up with if we actually owned the physical synthesizer. These custom sounds are saved in the Analog 5 Synth software interface, and there are hundreds to choose from, and I suspect that most people will be more than happy with the hundreds upon hundreds of pre-created incredible sounds. However, if you've ever owned one of these vintage synths from back in the day and you want to get all nostalgic and start tweaking things for yourself, no problem. You can dig as deeply into all of these lovely knobs, sliders and dials with synths such as the Yamaha CS80, Emulator 2, Matrix 12 or any of the others via the actual virtual instrument to come up with all your own unique custom sounds. Just buy the full plugin for any given synth. Now, the full virtual instrument plugin does cost between 150 and 199 euros, but given the sheer amount of work that's gone into these, I consider them to be an absolute bargain. Also, comparing 199 euros to £10,000 for a used CS80, for example, well, it's a no-brainer. So with the Arturia Keylab MKII, you're actually getting 2 for the price of 1 and much more on top. You're getting a professional grade MIDI keyboard controller to partner your DAW to perfection, and it integrates absolutely seamlessly, and you're also getting a fully fledged synthesizer with an amazing keyboard action that's very responsive and a dream to play. So if you're a gigging keyboard player, you can just put it into your flight case, grab your laptop and head off out to the venue with the software model equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of vintage synthesizers. It's also worth remembering that some of these vintage synths can't even be bought second hand anymore, or they're very rare and hard to find, and they usually cost a fortune. Yamaha, for example, only ever made about 3,000 CS80s over a 3-year period during the late 70s. And there are a few studios out there who've probably bought up 2 or 3 of them. They really are that good. I know bands like Empire of the Sun are big fans of them. I think they own 2. Well, now you can too with the superb Keylab MKII and Arturia's amazing synth models. Okay, so it might sound like I'm banging on about this keyboard and the Analog 5 software and the synth models, but they really are that good, and I think they're already becoming legendary. I know Noel Gallagher uses an Arturia Keylab with the Arturia V collection of synths personally, and he's blown away by what it can do. I'll put a link in the description below so that you can see the interview with Noel talking about the Arturia and demonstrating it. In fact, on Arturia's website, there's a massive list of well-known artists and producers who use their equipment. As usual, you'll find a link to Arturia's website in the description below, along with the other pieces of equipment that I'm talking about and demonstrating during this video.